She had sold the camera, the furniture, and her father's watch. It still wasn't enough. Her name is Sara Sinclair. She is black, beautiful, 29 years old. By day, she translates legal documents in Seoul. By night, she stands at the front desk of an exclusive private club in the city. Men like Kang Tae-jun never wait in line there. He is 38. They call him Silent Hand. He commands a criminal empire that Seoul's most powerful men pretend not to know. Sara's mother needs surgery. The estimate is always slightly above everything Sara has. 4 banks. 4 rejections. Then a proposition arrives. 1 evening of private company in exchange for the full amount. Sara refuses. 3 days later, her mother collapses. She calls back. She puts on the deep burgundy dress. She walks into his penthouse. He expected performance. She gave him nothing but the truth. They talked until 4 in the morning. About cities, about loss. She left before dawn with only what was agreed. She returned the rest and left a note on the table. What he chose to do with that note was something neither of them was prepared for. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The pawnbroker set the camera on the glass counter without looking at it a second time. 60,001. Sara had run the number 3 times before leaving the apartment. The camera, the reading table she had sold 2 weeks earlier, and her father's watch, those 3, reduced to market value over a single week, were supposed to close this month's gap on the clinic's monitoring fee and leave a small reserve before December. She had worked out the arithmetic on the back of a grocery receipt while standing in the elevator going down, coat still buttoned because she hadn't wanted to stop moving long enough to unbutton it. 60,000 wasn't enough. 75, she said. He turned the camera over. His thumb ran along the lens barrel in the practiced way of someone verifying that no amount of seller conviction was going to change a number he'd already fixed. 62. She took it. Outside, the cold pressed flat against her neck. She pulled the collar up, tucked the bills into her inner pocket, and walked toward the subway without looking back at the shop window. She had learned early that looking back was a form of spending with no return. The train took 17 minutes. She stood the whole way and used 12 of them, running the revised figure. 62,000 for the camera, November's second paycheck, after rent and the clinic's flat monthly fee, would leave perhaps 40,000 in reserve before December's loan installment hit. She had set that installment on automatic transfer in May because she had found in March and April that leaving herself the option to decide which obligation to delay introduced a kind of hesitation that cost more than the interest. The translation agency occupied the 3rd floor of a narrow building in Mapo-gu, between a printing shop and a dentist's office. Sara had worked there 4 years, long enough that the senior staff called her the one who always finishes before deadline, said with the faint, involuntary surprise of people whose expectations had not included being exceeded. Her Korean was near exact now. She caught errors in source documents that senior colleagues passed without noting, and she corrected them at her own stage without making anyone else's oversight visible. That approach had earned her a modest raise 18 months ago and a corner desk facing the street, where she could see, on winter afternoons, the low yellow light settling across the buildings opposite. It had not earned her the visa category that qualified for the Supplementary Medical Subsidy Program. That program covered 65% of major surgical costs for domestic residents. For foreign nationals on working visas, the coverage figure was 0. Sara had read that clause 12 times, the way people reread sentences they understand completely, but still cannot make sit still inside them. The afternoon batch was commercial. A freight invoice, a logistics supply contract, an English language partner memo that someone had rendered technically accurate but tonally wrong. the kind of translation that needed rewriting rather than editing. A difference Sarah had learned to recognize before she could have explained it. Her hands moved through the work with the efficiency of long practice. That gap between what her hands were doing and where the rest of her mind could remain, that was the part she valued. The rest ran the other track: rent. The clinic's monthly monitoring fee, the interest on the April loan, which she had accepted at the bank's standard rate without negotiating, because the alternative was not getting it at all. Her phone vibrated at 2:30. She finished the sentence she was typing, then turned the phone over. Payment due. Reminder 3. Current balance, 1,240,000 KRW. Due date, Dec 3. 22 days. She set the phone face down and returned to the memo. She cleared her desk at 6:15 and checked the output folder one final time before leaving. Not because she doubted the work, but because the check was part of the rhythm that kept the two parts of her day calibrated to each other. Legal translator until 6:30. Evening receptionist until 2 a.m. She had been running both since May, when the clinic revised their schedule and the monitoring cost shifted upward, and she had done the arithmetic and understood what it required. Nobody at the agency knew about the evenings. Nobody at the club knew about the mornings. Each version of her showed up complete, because partial attention was something she could not afford in either direction. She sold the watch on her lunch break, at a reseller's shop 2 blocks from the agency. The man behind the counter held it without speaking. Her father's watch, Japanese-made, thin case, simple cream dial, a small scratch across the crystal from a fall she had not witnessed. Her father had worn it every day she could remember seeing him clearly. When she arrived in Seoul at 22, she'd found an envelope slid under her apartment door, a note in his handwriting that said only, "I thought you should have this." She had not heard from him in the 8 months before the envelope arrived, and would not hear from him again for 4 months after. And standing in this shop 11 years later, she understood more clearly than she had then that the envelope had been one kind of goodbye among several he had offered her, each in a different form, none of them using the word itself. 900,000, the reseller said. She had researched the model. 1,100,000. He set the watch down with the deliberation of someone deciding whether his ceiling was worth defending. 1 million. Fine, she said. Outside, she stood for a moment on the sidewalk with the receipt in her hand, not looking at it. November pressed its gray light flat across the street. A delivery van blocked the near corner. A woman walked a narrow-legged dog around it. 2 students on scooters threaded through the gap between the van and a street vendor's cart. Seoul did not pause for private calculations. She had come to find something useful in that. The city's indifference was not unkind. It simply continued at full volume, regardless of what any given apartment was managing. There was no judgment in it, and no pity, and she preferred both of those absences to the alternative. She folded the receipt into her bag and walked back to work. The Lanthanum was 22 subway stops from the agency. The ride gave her enough time to revise the December figures once more. 1 million from the watch, 62,000 for the camera. Subtract the December loan installment, subtract the clinic fee due on the 15th. The sum landed better than October's. It remained far short of sufficient. The club occupied the basement level of a Gangnam building with no exterior indication, no sign, no visible entrance, a door that read like maintenance access. Behind it a second door, then a short staircase descending into a lobby that had the quality of a room that had been carefully considered rather than merely furnished. Every surface chosen, every light calibrated to produce exactly the degree of warmth required. Members paid an annual fee Sarah had looked up once, in her first week, and had not revisited. That number had a way of expanding into whatever space she allowed it. She changed in the small staff room. Dark clothing, neat hair. She kept gold earrings in her locker because Mr. O, the club manager, had mentioned once, not to her specifically, but in a way that functioned as instruction, that the room ran warmer when the staff wore gold. Mr. O managed the Lanthanum with the precision of someone who had understood at some point in his career that invisible management and effective management were the same thing. Sara had worked for him 14 months and had not identified a decision he'd made that she would have made differently. She clipped the earrings on, checked the mirror for 3 seconds, and went out. The evening produced its usual quality of invisible smoothness. She greeted 4 members by name as they arrived. She redirected a reservation conflict with 4 words and without surfacing it for anyone nearby. At 11, she spent 15 minutes in quiet conversation with the wife of a long-standing member who preferred not to sit alone, a woman whose Korean had the particular calibration of someone who had learned it somewhere other than Korea, slightly off the standard frequency, in a way that was recognizable to someone who had made similar adjustments. They found a small ease in that shared displacement and left it unnamed, which was the right thing to do with it. At 1:15, the last 2 tables finished. The room thinned. Sara restocked the welcome cards at the front desk and drew the folded paper from her inner coat pocket. The surgery estimate had been printed on clinic letterhead and folded so many times the creases had softened towards something close to cloth. The main figure at the top, 34,500,000 KRW, covered the procedure, anesthesia, post-operative care, and a recovery window the surgeon had estimated at 11 to 14 days. Below it, the page held 2 handwritings layered across several months. Deborah's first neat lines from the initial consultation in March, Sara's overtop, and in the margins after that, revised and retotaled as the situation shifted. They had sat at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings with tea going cold and worked through it together, Deborah doing the initial sums, Sara carrying the corrections forward, and the columns never arrived at the figure at the top. In August, they came close, when Sara sold the painting that had hung in her apartment since university. In September, they came close again after she negotiated a rate increase on a pharmaceutical translation contract. Both times, something else moved before she could close the gap: a revised clinic fee schedule, a medication Deborah's cardiologist had added, the exchange rate on the modest American pension that supplemented her mother's income. Each time, the shortfall settled back into position with the patience of something that was not going anywhere. In the bottom right corner of the estimate, circled in Sara's own hand, gap, 7.2 M. 1 million for the watch, she thought. 6.2 remaining. She folded the paper along its existing creases and returned it to her pocket. Her mother was still awake when Sara came home at 2:30. The reading lamp made a thin yellow line under the bedroom door. Sara set her bag down, and the door opened before she reached the kitchen. Deborah had always heard more than the rest of her body's new economy allowed her to act on. Over the 11 months since her second hospitalization had made living alone untenable, she had adapted, opening doors early, moving carefully between rooms, deploying her hearing in place of the speed she was conserving for other things. She stood in the hallway now in the earth-brown cardigan she wore most evenings, a button missing from the 3rd position that Sara had been meaning to replace for 6 weeks. The gold cross at her collar catching the hallway light briefly as she adjusted her glasses. "I wasn't waiting," Deborah said. "I was reading." "About what?" "Herbs. Growing them indoors." A short pause. "I'm thinking of trying basil on the windowsill." Sara opened the refrigerator. Their kitchen window faced an interior courtyard that received 4 hours of direct light on winter days. "It's December," she said. "Herbs are adaptable." Deborah came to the kitchen and sat, deliberate, each movement placed with the care of someone managing a resource that had a ceiling. The cardiologist had said conserve twice at the last appointment, and Deborah had received this with the particular nod that meant she had heard it and was forming a separate opinion. She noticed, as she had noticed for weeks, the way her mother's left hand rested on the table between sentences. Not idle, but positioned there with the quiet deliberateness of someone keeping one hand available. The first hospitalization had come from exertion, from lifting something heavier than she should have from the back of the pantry. Deborah had not mentioned it. Sara had rearranged the pantry that same week without explaining why, and Deborah had not mentioned that either. Sara made tea. She set the cups down and sat across from her mother, and they spent a portion of 2:30 in the particular quiet that had become their language. Close enough to say most things, careful enough not to say the rest. Deborah mentioned a trip some women from the expat church were organizing to Jeju Island. She mentioned it the way she said most things now, as information, without framing the absence as loss or the acceptance as peace. She would not be going. She delivered this the same way she delivered everything these days, as a statement of present fact. "How was tonight?" Deborah asked. "Quiet, good." Deborah looked at her over the rim of the cup with the look Sara had known since she was 6 years old, and attempting to pass off an uneaten dinner. She held it for a moment. She didn't say what it contained. She finished the tea and walked down the hallway in her measured, conserving way, and Sara listened to those steps until the bedroom door closed. She had been watching her mother move through this apartment for 11 months. It had taught her things about determination she had not expected to learn. The particular shape of someone continuing without performing the continuation. Deborah had never asked her to stay in Seoul. She had not needed to. Sara spread the surgery estimate flat on the kitchen table and sat with it in the quiet. The 4 loan rejection letters were in a folder in the bottom desk drawer. 2 banks had cited insufficient collateral. 1 had cited visa classification. The 4th, a credit union with lower thresholds, had cited both, which Sara understood as a way of declining without committing to a position that could be questioned. She had read each letter to the final line and filed it. She thought she might need documentation of something eventually, though she hadn't worked out what. After the 4th rejection, she started moving through the apartment with a clear eye. The spare television, barely used. Her good winter coat from her first year in Seoul, replaced by a cheaper one that was almost as warm. Reference books for a legal translation specialization she had internalized and no longer needed in paper. The reading table, the small bookshelf by the window, a spare chair that had been occupying a corner doing nothing. The camera was last. Her father had given her the first lens at Incheon Airport 11 years ago. Not the camera body, which she'd bought herself at 19 when she had saved for it, but the initial lens, a fixed 50mm, worn slightly at the filter thread, in a small cloth pouch. He had pressed it into her carry-on at the departure gate and said something the overhead announcement swallowed entirely. She had been reconstructing the sentence since. What she had to work with, his expression, which was not sad exactly, but something more precise than sad, a word she hadn't found in any of the 4 languages she worked in. His hand on her shoulder for 1 second, the particular way he turned and walked back through the crowd after she passed through security, not looking back, which at 21 she had read as composure and had since come to understand differently. There was also this: he had chosen a gift that was itself a means of making things rather than a record of what had already been. A lens rather than a photograph. She had thought about that many times since. Her father was someone who had provided means and then removed himself from what those means produced, and she had spent enough time with this understanding to know it was not cruelty, but something more complicated than cruelty, which in certain ways was harder to live alongside. 3 messages came from him across the following years, each further apart in time and shorter in content than the last. 2 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a final one arrived, brief, with the specific misspellings that indicated he was not managing well, closing with a phone number. She called it across 3 days. No one answered. She sent 2 messages to his address after that. They did not bounce back, which was worse than if they had. The silence was indeterminate, not closed, and she had found no way to file that. She knew better than to calculate what the camera had been worth to keep. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. 3 days later, she was crossing the lobby of her office building toward the elevator when someone said her name. The woman was someone she had registered at the Lanthanum before, twice, perhaps 3 times, always at a slight remove that read as oversight rather than membership. Korean, late 40s or early 50s, a structured charcoal jacket, dark hair, in an arrangement that required considerable care or considerable expense, or both. Her posture carried a long practice of making authority present itself as composure. Miss Sinclair. She stepped forward without hurrying. I'm Madam Lee. I manage private arrangements for certain club members. The elevator arrived. Sara held the door. I know who you are. Then I'll be brief. Madam Lee remained outside the cab with the stillness of someone who understood that waiting was its own form of leverage. A client requires a companion for one private evening, dinner, conversation, someone bilingual and composed. The amount offered is 36 million won. The number moved through Sara like pressure. Not shock exactly, but its structural equivalent. A sudden and complete awareness of the exact distance between that figure and the one circled in her coat pocket. 36 million. Surgery, recovery. 2 months of room to breathe. That's not something I do, she said. Madam Lee's expression gave nothing. I understand. Consider it. There's nothing to consider. The elevator door pressed against her hand. She released it and stepped inside. 3 floors down, alone in the small mirrored cab, Sara noticed that her hands were perfectly still, that she was holding them still, deliberately, with an effort she had not needed to make in months. The elevator descended in silence. Sara watched her reflection multiply across the mirrored panels, 3 partial versions of her face, none of them looking at the others. She had said no. The word had come before the number had finished leaving Madam Lee's mouth, clean and immediate, requiring no further consideration. She had said it the way she said things she meant, without softening it into a question. Outside, the night air arrived with the particular coldness of the financial district after midnight, when the last of the dinner crowds dissolved and the street belonged only to cabs and cleaning crews pushing carts through the silence. She hailed a cab without checking the price. She would figure it out the way she always figured things out. 1 shift, 1 payment, 1 small increment forward. She did not think about the number Madame Lee had named until she was already in bed, in the dark, staring at the ceiling while Deborah's breathing moved through the thin wall between their rooms. By then, it had stopped being a number. It had become a shape, the approximate shape of the surgery, the recovery weeks, the outpatient appointments that stretched across a calendar she had learned not to look at directly. She had been carrying that shape for so long it had become part of the atmosphere of her days, familiar enough to ignore. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. 3 days. She counted them later, not to justify anything, but because the sequence mattered in the specific way that sequences matter when you are trying to understand what made something inevitable. The first was a Sunday. Sara worked a double, came home after midnight, ate standing at the counter, slept without dreaming. The second was Monday. She split her shift with Hyunji, covered the late close, stayed 40 extra minutes, setting up mise en place for the morning crew because the prep cook had called out. On the third day, a Tuesday, she was 40 minutes from the end of her shift when she heard the crash. It came from the staff room, a single blunt impact, something meeting the floor without the incremental small sounds of a person trying to catch themselves. No stumble, no grab, no sharp intake of breath before the impact, just the sound of a body arriving. Sara was through the service door before the sound had finished. 2 other servers were already crouching. Deborah was between the lockers and the supply rack. On her left side, one arm bent at the wrong angle from where she had tried to break the fall. Her eyes were open and moving, but not tracking, not finding anything in the room to land on. Call an ambulance, Sara said. The room was small, and her voice was level, and it carried completely. The next 4 hours ran together in the way emergencies do. Not blurred exactly, but accelerated. each moment distinct and arriving too fast to hold. The ambulance hallway smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air. A doctor spoke with the measured cadence of someone delivering information they have delivered many times before: stabilization, existing vascular narrowing, what had very likely been occurring inside the left hemisphere for the better part of a year, without a single visible external sign until now. Sara signed everything they placed in front of her. She answered questions in complete sentences. She stood in the correct places and moved when she was directed to move. She did not raise her voice. She did not sit down until after 2 in the morning, in a plastic chair, in a corridor she could not leave, outside a room she could not enter. The light in that corridor was the particular yellow-white of places that cannot allow darkness. She sat in it for 2 hours with her coat in her lap and her hands resting flat on her thighs, and she did not think about Madame Lee or about numbers or about any shape at all. She thought about Deborah's arm at that angle and the way her eyes had been moving without finding anything. The cost summary arrived the following morning, attached to an admission document. Sara read it twice. Not because she had failed to understand it the first time, but because the second reading was a form of confirmation. The way you check a lock you already know you've turned. The reserve she had built across 6 months was now a number she could hold precisely in her mind, and it was approximately 1/3 of what the summary required. She folded the document along its original crease and put it in her bag. She walked to the hospital cafeteria and bought a black coffee and drank it standing at a high table by the window, looking out at the parking structure. The concrete was pale gray in the morning light. She finished the coffee and threw the cup away and went back upstairs. She was standing at the kitchen counter of the apartment when she picked up the phone. Not sitting at the table, not in the chair by the window, not anywhere that suggested rest or deliberation. Standing. Her bag was still over one shoulder, because she had walked in the door 14 minutes ago and gone directly to the kitchen to fill a glass of water, and she had drunk half of it and set the glass in the center of the dish towel and looked at it for a moment, not thinking, exactly, but present to the fact of being in her kitchen, in her body, in this particular hour. She found the number. She pressed call. Madame Lee answered before the second ring had finished. "I was wondering," Sara said, "whether the client arrangement was still available." A pause. Brief, considered. "It is." "Then I need to revisit the terms." The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Sara finished the water, rinsed the glass, placed it in the rack. She stood at the counter for another moment, with both palms flat against the tile, feeling the coolness of the surface. Then she straightened, picked up her bag, and went to her room. The dress had been in the back of the closet since the occasion she had bought it for, a gallery opening 2 years ago where she had known no one and stayed 2 hours and spoken to a sculptor about the relationship between negative space and intention. She unzipped the garment bag and laid the dress across the bed. The burgundy settled against the white duvet with a completeness she did not try to assign meaning to. She stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed loosely at her waist and looked at it for a long moment. She was not reconsidering. That had ended in the kitchen. What she was doing now was practical. She was inventorying the next several hours and deciding how she intended to move through them. She showered. She did her makeup with the deliberate care she brought to things she intended to do exactly once. Her hair she left as it naturally fell, the wide, loose curls settling past her shoulders, the deep brown catching the lamplight with the faint reddish undertone it always carried. She stepped into the dress and reached behind herself for the zip. She stood in front of the narrow mirror mounted on the closet door. She looked at herself for 4 seconds. She saw exactly what she expected to see. She picked up the clutch and turned off the lamp. The car arrived at 9:15. Dark, low, anonymous. The driver held the door and said nothing. Min-suk was already in the rear seat. He gave his name and his function without offering a hand. "Park Min-suk. I manage Mr. Kang's schedule. He said it with the brevity of someone who expects information to be sufficient. She gave her name in return, and they did not speak again for the first 6 minutes of the drive. When she glanced across the seat, she found him watching her. Not with the quality she had expected. Assessment had a particular sharpness to it, but with something closer to inventory. He was noting things with a discipline that had no aggression in it. She let him note them and kept her attention on the Gangnam Bridge, the lights trailing in long horizontal streaks across the black surface of the water below. "You're not nervous," he said. "Not a question." "I'm composed. There's a difference." He was quiet for a beat. Whatever he concluded, he kept to himself. He faced forward and did not speak again for the remainder of the drive, and she understood his silence as the particular courtesy of a man who has decided someone can be trusted with the space they occupy. The hotel lobby required no statement. Everything in it had simply been chosen to be correct. The specific correctness that money achieves when it no longer needs to demonstrate itself. Marble that did not announce itself as marble. Flowers that did not try to be noticed. Staff who moved with the quality of people who have been trained to be present without being visible. They crossed it without stopping. The elevator Minsuk called required a card, not a button. The penthouse floor held no other doors. He knocked twice at the end of the corridor. No answer, but a sound. The clean mechanical click of a door released from inside. He pushed it open and stepped aside without entering. Sara walked in. The room was wide and dark at its edges, defined entirely by the floor-to-ceiling glass running the full length of the far wall. The city lay beneath it, 40 floors of compressed light, the Han distant and dark, everything reduced by altitude into something almost calm. She read the room in a single pass, and then she saw the man. He was standing at the glass with his back to the room. The long black hair fell loose to his shoulders, perfectly straight, perfectly dark, the ends clean against the black shirt. His hands were at his sides. He was not looking at the city. She could tell from the slight angle of his head that he was looking at something in the reflection, or at nothing at all. He did not turn when she entered. The door clicked shut behind her. She crossed the room without hurrying and stopped at a distance that required him to acknowledge her without obligating either of them to anything further. She waited. He turned. She registered the face completely and without expression, the defined jaw, the high cheekbones, the dark eyes that were now moving across her with a quality that was neither polite nor impolite. He was simply looking at her. She looked back. "You're not what I was told to expect," he said. His English landed with a clean precision, each word placed with care. "What were you told?" "That you would be very beautiful." He let a half-beat sit between that and the rest, and very accommodating. "I'm one of those things." Something moved across his face, not a smile, an adjustment, like a lens refocusing. He moved from the window toward the low table at the center of the room, and she turned without following, simply orienting, the way she oriented in a full section, with peripheral attention and no particular anxiety. 2 chairs flanked the table. He did not gesture toward them. She took the nearer one and sat. He sat across from her. "You can pour," he said, indicating the decanter. "I'm not on shift." The adjustment this time was more definite, something in the set of his shoulders that read almost like recognition. He poured for himself, and then, after a pause, for her as well. She left her glass where he placed it. "Most people are afraid of me," he said. "Most people probably have context I don't have. I know what was described in the arrangement. I don't know you." He held his glass without drinking from it. "And if what was described were accurate, then I'd know more." She met his eyes directly. "It still wouldn't make me afraid. It would make me careful. Those are different things." He was quiet, not the quiet of a man waiting for his turn, but the quality of silence that belongs to people who are actually listening. His thumb moved once along the rim of the glass. "Why did you accept?" he said. Medical bills. You could have said something more palatable. You would have noticed. Yes. He set the glass down. What do you want from this evening? What was agreed? Nothing more. Nothing more. He reached into the inside of his jacket, which was draped over the arm of his chair, not on him, and she could not identify the moment he had removed it, and produced a slim envelope. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. She opened it, counted the contents with 2 efficient passes of her thumb, and understood within seconds what he had done. She took out the bills that corresponded to what had been specified in the call with Madame Lee. She folded them once and set the envelope back on his side of the table. She put her portion into the clutch without ceremony. You miscounted, he said. You gave twice the agreed amount. Deliberately. Then you know why I'm returning half. That isn't how this usually works. I know what was agreed. Her voice stayed even. My situation doesn't make the rest of it mine. He looked at the envelope, then at her. The expression that crossed his face was harder to read than anything he had shown her so far. Not calculation, not surprise, but something that was demanding more of his attention than either of those had required. He did not pick the envelope back up. He did not argue. He sat with the fact of what she had done, the way people sit with things that arrive in a form they had not anticipated. Outside the glass, the city held its slow, blurred light. In the room, something had shifted, not dramatically, not with the quality of resolution, but in the earlier way, when 2 people stop performing for each other and have not yet agreed on what to replace it with. He reached for his glass, and this time he drank. There's a harbor in Busan, he said after a moment. The light leaves west in the evening, slowly enough that you start to believe it isn't going to go. Sara picked up her own glass. How old were you? Young enough to notice things like that. I was 19 in Cape Town. There's a mountain that comes straight down into the city. At a certain hour, you can't tell where the rock ends and the cloud begins. She looked at the window. I noticed things like that then too. And now? Now I notice different things. He was quiet again, but it was a different texture of quiet than before. Not controlled, not a space he was managing. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had offered something unguarded and received something unguarded in return, and was still deciding what that meant about the next hour. What do you notice now? He asked. She looked at him. At the loose black hair, the dark eyes, the stillness he wore so completely that she could not locate where it had been learned, or what it was costing him to sustain it. She thought briefly about what an honest answer would contain and what it would cost her to give one, and then she thought about the note she had already drafted in her head in the car, the note she would leave before dawn, and she decided that precision was not the same thing as exposure. That you expected a different kind of evening, she said, and that you haven't decided yet whether you're disappointed. He held her gaze for a long moment in which neither of them moved, and the city went on doing what cities do, and the room held the particular silence of a place where something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. I'm not, he said quietly. He set his glass down and looked at her with an openness she had not seen in him before. Not softness exactly, but the specific quality of a face that has stopped arranging itself. Tell me something true, he said, something that isn't about tonight. Sara turned her face toward the window. The floor-to-ceiling glass ran the full length of the penthouse wall, and Seoul stretched below it without any visible end. Not the Seoul she moved through each morning on the subway, crowded and smelling of rain and instant coffee, and the particular exhaustion of people in transit, but the Seoul of distance. From this height, the noise had collapsed into light, and the city had become something nearly abstract. A table lamp behind her cast low warmth across the sofa and the space between them. The rest of the penthouse stayed dim. Necessity, she said. That's the true answer. Seoul was the city on the other end of the flight I could afford. Tae-jun waited. His glass sat untouched on the low table, the ice long since dissolved, the liquid settling clear. Some cities court you, he said. They want to be chosen. Seoul is not one of them. It opens a door and watches to see if you come through. I came through, Sara said. I know, he said. She pulled one knee up onto the sofa, the fabric of her dress, deep burgundy, pooled against the cushion. She looked at the city and not at him when she spoke next, and the distance in her gaze was not performance. It was the look of a person deciding what to give and how much of it to give. My father was a photographer, she said. Not professionally. He kept a camera with him, always the same one, Minolta. Black and silver, with a small crack in the casing that he covered with electrical tape. She paused. I sold it 8 months ago. His watch the week after. Tae-jun said nothing. His eyes moved to her face and stayed there. I'm not explaining the why, she said. You don't need to know. I know, he said again, and the way he said it, low, without any weight at all, told her that he did. Not the details, the shape, the particular quality of having sold the object you swore you would keep, the small, clean break it makes inside a person, the way the break heals and does not heal at the same time. She finally looked at him. He was watching her with an evenness she hadn't seen in him across the whole preceding evening. Not the practiced attention of a man in a negotiation. Something past that. Something that had stopped arranging itself. How long have you been in Seoul? He asked. 14 months. Before that? London. Before that, Chicago. He turned his eyes briefly toward the city. You've been moving. I've been managing, she said. The distinction, her tone made clear, was not a small one. He let that settle. His hand rested on his knee, loose and still. I have not moved in 12 years, he said. This city, this building, other addresses that are all different versions of the same room. He looked at the glass in front of him. The difference between staying and being unable to leave is not always obvious from the inside. Sara looked at him. She looked at his hands, at the way he held himself, at the particular stillness of a man who had long since learned to present stillness as control. She looked at the room itself, the penthouse, the space between the furniture, the distance that remained empty even when the room was occupied. Everyone around you looks afraid of disappointing you, she said. That must be a very lonely way to live. The words landed. She watched them land. His jaw tightened, not in anger, in something closer to recognition, a muscle contracting around something that had just been named aloud for the first time by a voice that was not his own. He looked away from her. His hand moved from his knee to the edge of the table, and one finger pressed lightly against the glass surface, as if confirming that it was solid. He stayed like that. Several seconds passed. Outside, far below, a single vehicle moved across an intersection, its headlights sweeping a long, slow arc before disappearing into a side street. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, through his nose. He did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was level and careful. I had a younger brother, he said. He was not afraid of me. He stopped there. The sentence carried its own complete weight, and he added nothing to it. Sara did not fill the silence. She understood this was not an opening for a question. It was the entire extent of what he would offer, and it was already more than she had expected. When did you lose him? She asked anyway, quietly, without pressing. Long enough ago that I no longer measure time from it, he said. Recently enough that I still know exactly how long it has been. She nodded. She understood this mathematics. It was the same mathematics she used herself, applied to a different calculation. They sat with it. The lamp behind her seemed to dim slightly, or seemed to. The city outside was lightening by degrees so subtle you couldn't catch them happening, only notice afterward that they had. The dark had shifted to something almost dark. The transition was invisible in the moment and irreversible after it. Sara checked her phone once, setting it face down on the cushion beside her quickly and without remark. Past 2 in the morning. She looked back at the window and said nothing about the time. They talked about smaller things after that. The feel of certain neighborhoods in the early morning. She told him that Mapo-gu at 5 a.m. felt like the city was giving itself permission to exist quietly for a few minutes before everything started again. He told her that when he walked, and he rarely walked anywhere without a margin of security around him, he moved fastest through Jongno, because something in the age of those streets passed through the soles of his shoes, and he understood it without being able to explain why. She told him she had wanted to be a literary translator, not legal documents, not contracts, novels. He asked which ones. She named 3. He knew 2 of them. They disagreed, briefly and without any real heat, about the ending of one. She said it was the only ending the book could have had, and he said that was exactly why it was a failure. And she looked at him in a way that meant she was turning the argument over carefully and finding parts of it worth keeping. She checked her phone again, past 3. The city below was unchanged. The lamp was the same. The night is ending, she said. It is, he said. Neither of them moved immediately. The conversation had wound itself down, not because it had exhausted everything between them, but because the night had taken what it was going to take, and what remained was a different kind of quiet. The transition, when it came, was not dramatic. It arrived the way things arrive when the talking has stripped away what was formal between 2 people. Simply and without announcement, like one room opening quietly onto another. Before the night was entirely gone, the space between them had closed, and what followed was quiet and private and carried no performance in either direction. Sara woke in the dark, not to a sound, to the absence of sound, the specific stillness that sits in the hour before anything begins. High-rise silence has weight to it. The floor-to-ceiling glass held the city below at a remove, and the city had slowed to almost nothing. A few lights steady, a few moving, the whole of it breathed down close to zero. She lay still for 3 seconds, listening, orienting. Then she moved. She sat up without using her hands, the trained quiet of a woman who had spent 14 months waking in circumstances where noise cost something. The sheets made almost no sound. Her feet found the floor, cool marble, and she stood in one motion. The dress was where she had left it. She dressed in the dark, working by touch, and the faint, ambient light that bled in from the city outside. Her movements were small and precise. She found her heels and carried them in one hand, soles facing out. The bathroom door opened inward. She slipped through and eased it shut behind her without a click. The light above the mirror came on automatically, bright, clinical. The kind of light that makes everything honest. She looked at herself in the glass. Her hair had kept most of its shape. A few curls had loosened at the temples. She smoothed them back with her fingertips. She looked at her own eyes for a moment, held her own gaze, and whatever she found there, she registered it and moved on. She came back into the bedroom carefully. Tae-jun lay still, one arm relaxed along his side, his breathing deep and even. His hair had come loose in the night and spread dark across the pillow. His face in sleep had dropped every arrangement. She allowed herself 1 second of looking and then looked away. The envelope was on the nightstand. She picked it up without sound. She moved to the far corner of the room, near the window, and opened it in the ambient light bleeding up from the city below. She counted the bills with her thumb and forefinger, the paper barely whispering. The amount was more, meaningfully more, than what they had agreed. She removed exactly what they had agreed upon. She folded those bills and placed them inside the inner pocket of her coat, which lay over the arm of the chair near the window. She placed the remaining money back beside the envelope on the nightstand. She set the envelope down beside it. She stood there a moment. Then she looked for paper. There was hotel stationery on the small writing table near the bedroom entrance. A single card, cream-colored, with a fine black border. A pen lay beside it. She picked up the pen and held it above the card for a moment, before she wrote anything. She started once. She drew a single quiet line through the words, not heavy, just canceling them. She held the pen still and looked at the city through the glass. Then she pressed the pen to the card and wrote, "You offered more than we agreed. My desperation does not make the rest mine." She read it back. She set the pen down. She placed the note on top of the returned money on the nightstand, where he would see it first, where he would have to pick it up before touching anything else. One look at him sleeping, one only, and brief. Then she turned. She gathered her coat from the chair, her bag from the floor near the sofa. She moved through the bedroom doorway and into the penthouse proper, the wide, dim living space, the windows running the full wall, the sofa where they had talked for hours, the low table with its 2 glasses still sitting exactly where they had left them. She crossed the room without looking back. The elevator was private, accessible only to this floor. She pressed the button, and the doors opened immediately, silently. She stepped inside. The doors closed. The descent began. She held her coat across her arm. She watched the floor numbers drop one by one, small and steady, each one a little more distance between the night and wherever she was going next. The gray came before the light. Tae-jun was already awake before he opened his eyes, aware first of the silence and then of the specific quality of the space beside him, which had changed in a way that had no ambiguity. He lay still for one moment, allowing himself that much. He opened his eyes. The room held the gray early light evenly, no shadows yet, every shape flattened to the same pale tone. He sat up. His hair fell forward across his face, and he pushed it back with one hand, held it there a moment, then let his arm drop. He sat at the edge of the bed and looked at the room, the chair near the window, the floor where her bag had been, the nightstand, the envelope, the money placed carefully beside it, the note on top. He reached for the note first. He read it. His eyes moved across the 2 lines once, taking them in. Then he read it again, slower, as if the words might arrange themselves differently on the second pass, offer some meaning he had missed on the first. They did not. He held the card a moment longer, then he set it back down on the nightstand, precisely, squarely, the white edge aligned with the edge of the wood. He stood and crossed the room to the window. Seoul was in the process of becoming morning. The gray at the horizon was giving way to something paler, and far below the streets were beginning to accept the first delivery vehicles, the first figures on the sidewalks, the city assembling itself again from the ground up the way it did every morning, without ceremony and without pause, and with no acknowledgement that any night had passed at all. He stood at the glass in bare feet and watched it for a long time. He watched the money she had left on the nightstand reflected faintly in the glass. He watched the note. His hand moved to the window frame and rested there, one palm flat against the painted steel, feeling the slight cold of it. He stood like that until the gray had shifted enough that the color of the morning became clear. Then he picked up his phone from the nightstand. He found the number without searching for it. It connected on the second ring. "Find her," he said. A pause on the line. "And if I find her?" "Find her," Tae-jun said. "Do not frighten her." Min-suk asked nothing further. The call ended. Tae-jun set the phone down beside the note. He looked at the city below him, and then at the note, and then at the money she had counted out and left behind with precision. He picked up the note once more and read it a third time, standing at the window in the early morning with the city lightening behind the glass, and Seoul below him was the same city it had always been, and different from it in some specific way he could not name yet. Min-suk worked the way he always worked, without noise and without waste. He started with the name confirmed from the club's booking system, cross-referenced it with the residence registry, and had 2 employment records pulled within the first hour. A legal translation agency in Mapogu, licensed. Clean accounts. Her record showed 11 months of continuous work, irregular hours, above average output scores in her category. The agency handled corporate contracts, visa filings, and communications for foreign nationals. Nothing unusual in any of it. The second location was a private club in Gangnam, legitimate, membership-based, operating within all required licensing. Her name appeared in the system as contract entertainment staff. Payments logged correctly under her registered identification. Everything documented where documentation was required and nothing documented where it was not. He moved to the financial records. 4 loan applications within a single quarter, all rejected, all submitted within 90 days of each other. The sums were not large by any standard Min-suk operated within. By the standards of her registered income, they had been acts of desperation restrained only by the requirement to appear composed. The hospital records came next. A foreign patient at one of the private cardiology units in central Seoul. Long-term case, ongoing. The billing contact on file, Sara Sinclair. The outstanding balance had been reducing, slowly and consistently, over the course of several months. Not in large payments, but in increments, at a pace that suggested everything else had already been tried. He cross-referenced the pawn transaction database. A camera, Minolta, model noted, casing listed as damaged with tape repair along the seam. A men's watch. 3 pieces of furniture logged over 6 months. A pattern of a person converting objects into continuity, selling what could be sold in order to hold the same ground. He ran the security checks last because he already knew what they would find. He was correct. No criminal record across any jurisdiction accessible to him. No registered associations with rival organizations or known information brokers. No secondary phone linked to a secondary identity. No financial inputs that suggested external coordination or a pattern of manipulation. No second life running parallel to the visible one. Nothing that pointed anywhere except toward a woman managing a private disaster with whatever means were available to her. He arrived at Tae-jun's office by mid-afternoon. Tae-jun was standing at the window, a different window from a different floor, but the posture the same, standing, hands at his sides, face toward the city. He did not turn when Min-suk entered. Min-suk stood near the center of the room and delivered the report in the order the information had been gathered. Agency, club, loan records, hospital billing, pawn history, security clearance. He used the minimum number of words the substance required. He offered no interpretation. No editorial weight of any kind. Tae-jun listened without moving. His hands stayed at his sides throughout. His face remained toward the window for the first half of the report, then shifted slightly, not toward Min-suk, toward the middle distance, the angle of a man recalibrating something in private. He said nothing at all. He gave no indication of whether any of it surprised him. When Min-suk finished, the room held the silence for a moment. Both locations, Tae-jun said. Yes. Min-suk confirmed it, without elaboration. I can have someone there within the hour. Tae-jun's eyes stayed on the city below. His hands remained at his sides, perfectly still. Don't go yet, he said. Min-suk stayed where he was. He asked nothing. He had worked for this man long enough to know that this instruction was not a deferral and not a refusal. It was something positioned just before a decision. A man standing at a closed door with his hand already on the handle, not yet having chosen whether to turn it. The surgery took 4 hours and 12 minutes. Sara knew this not from the clock on the waiting room wall, which she had avoided looking at directly, but from the slow accumulation of small events around her. 2 nurses changing shifts, a family group in the corner that arrived, received news, and left. When the surgeon came through the door and said the words, successful, stable, no complications, Sara pressed her palms flat against her thighs and kept her back straight and said thank you in a voice that came out more level than she expected. Deborah's recovery was slow in the particular way of women who have been sick longer than they admitted. The first days she slept more than she was awake. When she was awake, she spoke in shorter sentences than usual and kept her hands folded over the blanket in a way that made her look smaller. Sara came every evening after the translation agency closed and sat in the chair beside the bed. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not. On the third day, Deborah looked at Sara for a long moment and said, "You've got something behind your eyes." Sara said, "I'm tired." "Not that," Deborah said. Sara adjusted the blanket at the foot of the bed and said she was going to get water from the hall. She came back with 2 cups. Deborah had closed her eyes. The subject did not reopen. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic, and the particular warmth of central heating kept too high. Sara learned the layout of it in the first 2 visits: the window that let in morning light on the left side, the narrow wardrobe where she had hung Deborah's robe, the monitor that beeped at a rhythm she had stopped hearing by the 4th day. She brought a paperback, a small pouch of good tea, 2 cups from home. These were not gestures she announced. She simply brought them and set them in their places. She returned to both jobs the following week. The translation agency had a backlog she worked through steadily, line by line, reference checked against the glossaries pinned above her desk. The Lanthanum required the particular composure of someone who has learned to leave whatever happened in the previous 12 hours at the door. She managed both. She ate irregularly and slept deeply when she slept at all, and she spoke to no one about the arrangement she had made or what had followed from it. There was a quality to her in those days that her colleague at the agency noticed but could not name. Something like a woman who has taken a long step and is not yet sure what the ground beneath her second foot will feel like. On the 8th evening of Deborah's recovery, Sara was at the Lanthanum's reception desk when the room changed. It was not a dramatic shift. No one raised their voice. There was no announcement. It was the kind of change that moves through a room like pressure through water, invisible, but felt by anything with the sensitivity to register it. The senior floor manager, Choi, took a position near the entry corridor that he only took when someone of specific importance was expected. 2 of the front waitstaff, who spent most evenings in a loose diagonal near the bar, straightened and moved slightly apart. Sara watched this from behind the reception desk without moving her head. 2 men entered first, not clients. She could tell by the way they moved through the space, not as guests finding their bearings, but as men mapping it, their eyes doing a systematic arc across the room, touching the corners, the rear exits, the bar. She had seen this done for visiting officials and once for a government minister. She had not seen it done for a private client before. Min-suk came through the doors next. He crossed to a position near the entrance and stood with his hands loose at his sides, facing the room. He did not speak to anyone. Then Kang Tae-jun walked in. His hair was tied back at the nape of his neck, long and dark, 2 or 3 strands that had come loose near his jaw. Charcoal suit, a dark shirt beneath it. He moved through the entrance the way water moves through a space it has always occupied, not quickly, not slowly, with a completeness that left no part of the room unaccounted for. The bow began with Choi and moved through the senior staff in sequence, a wave breaking from one end of a shoreline. Tae-jun acknowledged none of it. He was already looking at the reception desk. Sara held her position. Her hands rested flat on the desk surface. She did not bow. He walked directly to her. The room around them was not quiet. The music still played. Guests still moved between tables. But there was a quality of attention directed at the desk from every professional in the room who understood what they were watching. He stopped on the other side of the desk and looked at her. "You disappeared," he said. "Our agreement ended," Sara said. "Yours did." She kept her eyes on his. Her hands were still on the desk. She let 2 seconds pass, then 3. "Please don't approach me here again," she said. Tae-jun looked at her. It was not an angry look. It was the look of a man reading something that requires more time than he currently has. Then he said, "All right." He turned and walked to a private table at the far end of the room. A staff member appeared ahead of him with a menu. He sat, He did not look back. Sara looked down at the booking ledger in front of her. She turned one page, then she stood where she was and did not reach for anything for the space of several breaths. That was what settled into her for the rest of the shift. Not the confrontation, not his presence, not even the fact that the entire professional hierarchy of the room had rearranged itself around his entry. It was that he had listened. She had asked him to stop, and he had stopped. And this was more disorienting than refusal would have been. A man who argues reveals his shape. A man who complies without explanation reveals nothing at all. The cafe near the translation office was small and well lit, with 4 tables along one wall and a counter that smelled of roasted coffee and cardamom. The server, a young woman named Ji-yeon who wore her hair in 2 clips, knew Sara's order and began making it when Sara pushed through the door. Sara took the corner table. Ji-yeon brought the coffee without being asked. Sara put her phone on the table and did not pick it up for several minutes. Outside, the street was thinning toward the end of the evening. A delivery motorcycle moved past. A couple under the awning of the shop next door argued quietly and then stopped and walked on together. She picked up the phone. She typed the name she had heard a colleague whisper 2 evenings ago, when Choi had leaned toward another senior manager near the service corridor and said it low. Kang Tae-jun. She had not been meant to hear it. She had heard it. Kang Security Holdings. The results came back in seconds, clean and extensive. Legitimate business coverage, private security contracts, 2 government infrastructure partnerships, a corporate headquarters listed in Gangnam, affiliations with real estate conglomerates, named in the articles with the casual familiarity of entities that had been in the background of large Korean commerce for a generation. A photograph from a business publication, Tae-jun, in a formal suit, at an industry event, standing with 2 other men, none of them smiling in the way of men who smile for photographs, but rather in the way of men who have decided to appear at ease. She read through 3 articles, then she scrolled further. The 4th result was not business coverage. It was a news piece from 4 years ago. A competitor CEO, a man named Young Hyun-wook, who had been reported missing by his family and was found 3 months later in circumstances the article described as under active investigation. The investigation had continued for 16 months. It had not concluded. A quote near the bottom of the piece was from a prosecutor who described the case as presently inactive. Tae-jun's name appeared in one sentence, a former shareholder in the dissolved holding company that Jung had run, mentioned with the particular neutrality that journalists use when they have no evidence but have something they want on record. Sara read that sentence twice. She put the phone face down on the table. Her coffee had gone cold. She was aware of this, but did not move to drink it or push it away. The cafe was quiet around her. Ji-yeon behind the counter rinsing something, the soft background sound of the street. Sara sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight against the chair. She was not searching for what she felt. She was not naming it. What she was doing, slowly and without hurry, was placing what she now knew beside what she had already done, and understanding that the distance between them was not simple and would not become simple quickly. She had made a choice in a moment of necessity. That choice existed inside a larger context she had not known at the time. The question of whether the choice would have been different with full knowledge was not one she intended to answer tonight. Ji-yeon came to the table and asked gently if she wanted a fresh cup. Sara looked up. "No," she said. "Thank you." She reached for the cold coffee and drank what remained. Then she put on her coat and left. The car was waiting 3 days later, parked outside the translation agency, when Sara came through the door at the end of her afternoon shift. Black, recent model, the driver standing beside it in a way that suggested he had been told to be unobtrusive. He stepped forward when she came through the door and said her name. "It's been arranged for you," he said. "By request." "By whose request?" Sara said. He answered. She thanked him, picked up her bag, and walked to the bus stop. The follow-up appointment was at 4 in the afternoon. Make Sara, in the corridor outside the cardiology unit, and asked if he could speak with her briefly. Deborah was settled in the waiting area with a magazine she was not reading. The arrangement was already in place, the doctor explained. Upgraded monitoring equipment, a private room for 2 additional weeks, all costs covered through a third-party account. He said the account holder's name without being asked. Sara said, "I'll need to reverse it." Dr. Yoon said nothing. He held the clipboard at his side. She made the calls standing near the window at the far end of the hall, in the white afternoon light that came through the glass and made the corridor floor look pale. It took 40 minutes and 3 separate administrators. She spoke quietly throughout and did not raise her voice once, and by the time the last call ended, everything had been returned to its original arrangement. Dr. Yoon, who had remained somewhere in the corridor without appearing to wait, looked at her once when she put the phone in her pocket. He kept his expression professional and said nothing. When she came back to the waiting area, Deborah looked up from the magazine. "Something was arranged without my asking," Sara said. "I reversed it." Deborah considered this for a moment. "Good," she said, and turned a page she had not been reading. The key card arrived in an envelope at the front desk of Sara's building. The concierge handed it over with the neutrality of a man who has worked building management long enough to remain uninvested in whatever passes through. There was a note. Sara read it in the elevator. She went inside, found an envelope in her desk drawer, placed the card and the note together inside it, and sealed it. She addressed it by hand. She sent it the following morning before the translation shift began. She found him outside the hospital the next afternoon. He was not hiding. He was leaning against the low wall along the hospital's front garden, hands in his coat pockets, visible from the entrance and from the street, making no effort to be anything other than present. He looked like a man who had nowhere else to be and had decided to be here. Sara stopped in front of him. She did not adjust her bag or her coat. "You believe money makes every decision yours," she said. "Money keeps people alive," Tae-jun said. "Sometimes," she held his gaze, "but it also gives men like you excuses to control them." Something moved behind his eyes. Not hurt, something harder than that, and older. He said, "I am not trying to control you. I am trying to correct something." "You can't correct a choice someone made freely," Sara said. "You can only make them feel they owe you." "That is not what I intended." "I know what you intended." Her voice was level. "What you intended and what you're doing are 2 different things. I think you know that. I think you've been comfortable not looking at the difference for a long time." Tae-jun was quiet. It was not the quiet of a man preparing his next sentence. It was the quiet of a man who has been handed something accurate and is standing with it, figuring out how much it weighs. He looked at her. She held where she was. "Don't arrange anything else," she said. "For me, for my mother, for anything in my life." She picked up her bag and walked past him toward the entrance. He did not call after her. She did not turn around. Min-sok was standing near the building's side wall, far enough to be separate from the conversation, but close enough to have heard every word. He watched Sara go through the hospital doors. Then he looked at Tae-jun. He had nothing to say, and he said nothing. 3 days after that, Sara came home from the late shift at the Lanthanum at 2:30 in the morning. She put her bag down inside the door. Then she stood very still. The door had been unlocked. She stood in the entrance for a moment, her hand still on the handle, reviewing this fact. She was not careless with locks. She had not been careless with locks in the 4 years she had lived in this apartment. She pulled the door shut behind her and went through the rooms systematically, turning on each light as she went. The kitchen, the bathroom, the small bedroom she used as a workroom for translation files. Everything appeared to be in its place. The laptop on the desk, the translation folders. The petty cash in the kitchen drawer, undisturbed. The shelf near the front door where she and Deborah kept storage, boxes of old papers, 2 photo albums, Deborah's reading glasses in their case. One box had been moved, not much. A few centimeters to the left, its lid at a slightly different angle than she remembered setting it. She called the police. 2 officers arrived within the hour and were thorough and professional. They found nothing missing. They classified the entry as a probable attempted burglary interrupted before completion, recommended a deadbolt upgrade, and left her with a report number and a card. She called Deborah and said the door had been left open. She said she'd had it checked. She said everything was fine. Deborah asked 2 questions. Sara answered them. They said goodnight. Sara checked the lock 3 times. She stood in the entrance and pressed her hand flat against the door, feeling for any give in the frame. There was none. She went to the kitchen and sat down at the table. She did not turn the light off. The refrigerator hummed. 4 floors below, the city moved in the particular way it moves after midnight. Sparse, deliberate, belonging to itself. Sara put her hands flat on the table and sat in the light, and the apartment settled around her into a silence that was not entirely the same silence it had been before she left for work that evening, though nothing in it had a name yet, and she was not going to give it one tonight. Parte 5. The days that followed the hospital argument held a quality Sara hadn't anticipated. Quiet. No car appeared at the curb. No envelope slipped under her door. No name came across the club's reservation screen in a way that made her careful how she held her face. Kang Tae-jun had gone still, and Sara moved through her week, as though walking through a room where something heavy had been recently removed. The space it left was part of the furniture now, as real as anything that remained. She did not allow herself to be relieved. She had been careful enough, long enough, to know that silence was not withdrawal. Silence was assessment. She kept her routines clean and her movements predictable, and waited, the way you wait for weather you can already smell. He came on a Thursday evening. Sara was behind the reception desk when the reservation appeared, a standard 2-top near the entrance, not the private room he had always taken, the one with the glass and the low light and the view of the river. A common table. A table you sat at when you wanted to watch the door. He ordered from the menu like someone who hadn't eaten there before, though he had eaten there many times. He did not look toward reception. He sat with his back to the wall and his jacket still on, and did not summon anyone or ask for anything beyond what he had ordered. Sara worked her shift. She kept track of him the way she kept track of all the difficult details, steadily, without drama. He drank his whiskey and left the second one untouched, and did not linger beyond what was reasonable. She was collecting her coat when she turned and found him standing a few feet down the corridor, not in her way, just there. He had his hands in his pockets, and his hair was tied back, and there was something in the quality of how he stood that was different from every other time she had seen him. He was waiting, not occupying the space the way he usually occupied space, as though it had been designated for him, but simply standing in it, at a careful remove. "Coffee," he said, not an arrangement, just the word. Sara looked at him. Why? He considered this. He did not offer a prepared answer. "Because the last conversation we had was the most honest one I've had in years," he said, "and I'd like another one." She studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. He didn't fill the silence. That alone was unusual enough to mean something. "1 hour," she said. "Public place. I choose where." "All right. No conditions. No amendment." She walked out through the club entrance, and he did not follow until she had already gone. She chose a cafe on a side street in Mapo that had been open since before the neighborhood changed. Orange-tiled countertop, fluorescent light, coffee that arrived in ordinary ceramic cups without ceremony. It was not the kind of place that impressed anyone. That was precisely the point. Tae-jun arrived without Min-suk. He came through the door and found her in the booth by the window, and something crossed his expression. Not discomfort exactly, but a mild recalibration, the way a person looks when ordinary spaces are genuinely new to them in a particular context. He sat across from her and picked up the laminated menu and set it down and ordered the same thing she had ordered, without asking what it was. Sara wrapped both hands around her cup. "What do you actually want?" she said. "Not the arrangement, not the money, not my compliance." He didn't reach for anything. He folded his hands on the table. "I want to know what you do on days when there's nothing that needs surviving." Sara looked at him. She thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. "I don't know what those days feel like anymore," she said. "Neither do I." They drank their coffee. Outside, the side street went about its business. A delivery van, a woman walking a dog, a man in an apron sweeping the entrance of a shop. Sara told him about a film she had seen alone the previous winter. A French film, small, about nothing in particular, a woman walking through a city for reasons that were never made clear. She had thought about it for weeks afterward. She couldn't have said why. She mentioned this not because it was interesting, but because it was true. Tae-jun listened. He told her about a street in Lisbon he had walked once, years ago, during a trip that was not personal, that should not have had any margin for personal things. He had taken a wrong turn and found himself on a steep, narrow street between old buildings, and for 10 minutes he had stood at the top of it and simply looked. He had never gone back. He did not explain why. "You could go back," Sara said. "I know." He turned his cup on the saucer once, slowly. "That's not why I remember it." The cafe was warm. Someone was playing something quietly from a speaker behind the counter, something old, instrumental. Sara became aware at some point that she was not watching the door the way she usually watched doors. She corrected this without making it visible. But it had happened, and she noted that it had happened. She told him what Seoul sounded like at 4 in the morning from her apartment, the particular absence of traffic, the way a single car became audible from several blocks away, the way the city seemed to breathe differently when it thought no one was listening. He said he knew exactly what she meant. That Seoul at 4 in the afternoon sounded as though it had been designed to prevent exactly that quality from existing. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of the second cup, where it became apparent, not stated, not performed, simply apparent, that neither of them had told anyone else any of this, not these specific things. Not in these exact terms. The weight of that was very quiet. Neither of them mentioned it. Sara checked the time. "You said 1 hour," he said. "I did." She picked up her bag, and he stood when she did, rising from the booth out of something older than his choices. At the door she stopped with her hand on the frame. "Don't make arrangements for me without asking," she said. "Don't send cars. Don't fix things I haven't asked you to fix." "All right." She looked at him directly. "If you do it again, this is the last conversation." He held the door open. She walked through it. She did not look back. She knew, without looking, that he stayed there until she turned the corner. She did not know what to do with that knowledge, so she walked home with it and placed it somewhere without a name. Han Seo-yun arrived at the agency on a Tuesday morning, which was already full and had no room for complications. Sara was at her desk when the receptionist knocked and said there was someone asking for her personally. Not a client, no appointment. She came to the entryway and found Seo-yun standing in the gray light in cream and camel, immaculate, one gloved hand resting on the strap of a bag that cost more than the monthly lease on the office space. She smiled the way people smile when they have already decided how the interaction will end. They went to the small conference room at the back. 4 chairs, a table, a potted plant that was losing its lower leaves. Sara offered water. Seo-yun declined. "I'll be direct," Seo-yun said, which was what people said when they intended to be indirect. "Tae-jun and I have a history that predates many things. Our families, the understandings between them, these are not casual. They represent years of architecture." Sara listened. She kept her hands still in her lap. Seo-yeon did not say step aside. She did not say you are a problem. She spoke carefully, graciously, as someone who had decided to extend a courtesy before a confrontation became necessary. She called Tae-jun's attention and interest he has taken. She spoke about the weight of what had been assumed between their families for a long time. She said the word delicate 3 times in different sentences. Sara waited until she was finished. Did Tae-jun send you? She said. Something shifted in Seo-yeon's expression. No. Then this conversation is between us, Sara said. Not him. Seo-yeon looked at her for a moment. The graciousness held, but something moved beneath the surface of it. She stood and smoothed her coat. Sara thanked her for coming. She meant it in the specific way you mean something that is also a dismissal. She walked Seo-yeon to the front door and watched her cross to the car, waiting at the curb, and get in without looking back. Back at her desk, Sara straightened the papers in front of her and took one careful breath and went back to work. She processed 2 translation files and answered 4 emails and did not think about Seo-yeon. But she filed it. All of it. The phrasing, the assumptions, the careful architecture of what had been implied rather than stated. The alliance Seo-yeon represented. The long-standing understanding Tae-jun had never mentioned. She placed each piece precisely in the part of her mind where she kept things that would matter later. Then she moved on to the next file. The black car appeared on a Wednesday. Sara noticed it because she noticed such things. Parked slightly too far from the nearest building to be a delivery vehicle, slightly too close to her entrance to be coincidental. She noted the plate and went upstairs. Thursday morning it was back. Sara took a different route to work. That evening, coming home, it was there in the same position. Someone had moved it and returned it. That was specific. That was deliberate. She typed the message standing at her front door before she went in. She had never initiated contact before. She was aware of this as she sent it. The car outside my building. Was that you? His reply was brief. Yes. Someone broke into your apartment. She had known. She had come home 2 weeks ago to a door she had left locked in a certain way that was no longer locked that way. Nothing had been taken. That was the part that made it not nothing. I'm aware. The police filed a report. The police won't find who did it. Sara read the message twice. Is that a fact or a threat? A pause, longer than his previous replies. A fact. She looked at the wall above her desk. She thought about the locked door and the empty room and the particular message that sent, arriving in the precise absence of anything disturbed. Remove the car, she sent. The car was gone the next morning. The curb was empty, ordinary, belonging to the street again. She stood at her window and looked at the space where it had been. She understood what its removal had cost him, the exposure it created, the specific act of choosing restraint over position. She understood he had done it anyway. She carried this alongside everything else and said nothing about it to anyone. Dr. Yoon's office called Sara at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon. The voice on the other end was careful in the way medical voices learn to be. Sara Sinclair, brought in that morning for a routine follow-up, was now being kept overnight. A cardiac episode, stable, but they wanted to monitor her through the night. Sara put her phone in her pocket and told her supervisor she had a family matter and collected her bag and left. The afternoon was gray and cold, and the taxi took longer than it should have. She sat in the back with her hands flat on her knees and looked at the city going past and did not think about anything in particular, which was how she managed the transit between receiving information and arriving at the place where it had consequences. The hospital waiting area had the same quality all hospital waiting areas had: suspended time, artificial light, a space designed to make difficult things feel orderly. Sara sat in a plastic chair by the window and waited while they finished settling Deborah into her room. Dr. Yoon came out eventually. He explained what had happened in the language of monitoring and stability and precaution. He used the word encouraging in a sentence about her numbers. Sara thanked him. She went down the corridor and pushed open her mother's door. Deborah was already smaller in the hospital bed, not in height, but in the way people contracted when the ordinary materials of their life were replaced by institutional ones. The gold cross necklace was still there. Her reading glasses were folded on the bedside table. She looked at Sara and said, "You're doing that face." "What face?" Sara said. "The one where you've decided something is your fault." Sara sat in the chair beside the bed. She was careful about how she arranged herself in it. "How are you feeling?" she said. Deborah reached over and found her hand. "Whatever you sold to get me here," she said, "it wasn't wrong, but you need to understand something." She waited until Sara was looking directly at her. "I was never supposed to be the price of your life." Sara held her mother's hand. The fluorescent light above the bed hummed faintly. Outside in the corridor, someone pushed a cart past. Sara did not speak for a long time, and Deborah did not require her to. She stayed until Deborah was asleep, her breathing slow, and even in the institutional quiet. Then Sara gathered her coat and took the elevator down and found a taxi and went home. The apartment was the same. Of course it was the same. She came in and set her bag down and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the light still off. Then she went into the main room and sat down on the floor against the wall, her back to the plaster, her knees loose in front of her. Not dramatically, the chair was across the room and the floor was there, and it was enough. She stayed like that. The city outside was settling into its late-night register, the pitch below traffic, the sound of distance accumulating. This was the bottom of something, and she knew it. Not a crisis with clear edges, not a collapse with observable dimensions, but the specific quiet weight of having arranged everything as carefully as she knew how, and still sitting on the floor, afraid it would not be enough. There was no name for this particular configuration of fear. She was not going to invent one. Her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She answered on the second ring because she was already holding it. The voice was male and unhurried. It said, "Miss Sinclair, you've attracted the wrong kind of attention. It would be better for your mother if you reconsidered your associations." The call ended. Sara lowered the phone and looked at it in her hand. The voice had known her name and her mother's existence and the exact source of where the attention had come from, and it had delivered all of this without raising itself above conversational volume. That was not Tae-jun's method. This was something older, something that didn't need volume to make itself understood. She sat with this for a moment. Then she called Tae-jun. It connected before the second ring. She told him what the voice had said, word for word, in the same flat register it had used. She heard the quality of silence on his end change, not alarm, but a specific kind of attention, the sound of a room where all other noise had been removed. "Where are you right now?" he said. "Home. Don't open the door tonight without calling me first." "Who made that call?" she said. A pause. A real one. "I don't know yet," he said. "I will." She ended the call. The apartment held its ordinary silence around her. She sat back against the wall with the phone resting on her knee and the city outside continuing at its midnight frequency, and what she felt was not safety. She was not going to convince herself she felt safer. But somewhere beneath the weight of the evening, there was a thread of something she had no better word for. The call connected before the second ring, the quality of "I will," spoken without hesitation into the dark. She did not feel alone, and she could not reconcile that with the fact that an unfamiliar voice had already found her address, and she was not going to try to reconcile it tonight. She stayed against the wall, with the phone warm in her hand, and the city moved outside in the dark, and the threat that had reached her had no name yet, but had made itself at home in the silence all the same. Kashter parte six, roteiro. K ara, 1 ara. The cafe where they agreed to meet was on the second floor of a building that faced the river, and the morning light came in horizontal and clear through the tall windows. Sara arrived before him. She ordered tea she did not intend to drink and kept her coat on because she had not planned to stay long. And then Tae-jun walked in, and she understood, from the way he moved, steady, without preamble, like a man who has already decided what he owes, that this was not the kind of conversation that would be brief. He sat across from her, no bodyguard at the door, no car double parked outside that she could see. He had his hair tied back in the way she associated with his formal settings, and he folded his hands on the table and began. Chairman Choi Dong-wook, 61 years old, silver-haired and publicly charitable. His name appeared on 3 hospital wing dedications and on the board of 2 universities. The public face was immaculate. The real history was not. Tae-jun laid it out without drama. Years of systematic funds siphoning through the Kang organization's logistics infrastructure, building networks of corrupt officials not out of loyalty to anyone, but as personal insurance, accumulated over 2 decades in the way a man accumulates something he intends never to need, but wants desperately to have. The connection to Deborah was older than Sara had guessed. Her mother had worked in financial administration for an international logistics company in her early career, a position she had left without incident. She had been a thorough employee. She had copied records that seemed irregular to her, the kind of paperwork that does not add up the way it should, the kind that a careful woman notes and sets aside and intends to revisit. She had not known what she was copying. She had left the company the way competent people leave jobs that quietly unsettle them, with her things in a box, a good reference letter, and no forwarding note. Choi had known about Deborah for some time. He had believed, apparently, that she had either destroyed whatever she had taken or had already deployed it. The calculation had shifted when someone moved money in a way that directed attention back toward old records, and Choi's people had begun revisiting names. The break-in at Sara's apartment had been his, thorough, professional, and it had found nothing because the thing they were looking for was not there. The phone call had been the second step, the warning that precedes something worse. Sara listened to all of it without interrupting. When Tae-jun finished, she looked at him across the table. The tea between them had gone the gray-brown of cold and untouched. She asked one question. "And you knew this while I was reversing your apartment offer and sending your car away." "I knew some of it," Tae-jun said. "Not all." "You should have told me." "Yes." He did not explain the reasoning. He did not offer the version of events where the incomplete information had been protective rather than withheld. He agreed, and sat with it, and waited. Sara looked at her hands on the table and thought about that word, yes, and what it cost someone who had clearly spent his life attaching qualifications to it. She stood. She put her coat straight. She said she would call him. She left first. She took the subway to her mother's neighborhood. It was a clear morning, and the trees were holding the last of the cold, and she walked the familiar block slowly, arranging the words she would use. She had decided on the way over that she was not going to alarm her mother. She was going to ask a careful question about old work history and see where it led. Deborah was in the kitchen when Sara arrived, and the apartment smelled of coffee and something baked from earlier that morning. Sara sat at the kitchen table and accepted a cup she did not need and described, in the most neutral language she could construct, what she had learned about the logistics company, the irregularities, the financial structure, the general shape of the problem, without naming Choi, without using the word threat. Deborah listened. She was quiet for long enough that Sara thought she might be deciding what not to say. Then Deborah stood and moved through the apartment in the unhurried way of someone who has made a private decision, and went to the bookshelf in the living room. She moved a small plant, reached behind a row of books, and brought down the white music box with the painted roses, the one that had lived on that shelf for as long as Sara could remember. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it down carefully. She lifted the lid. The mechanism turned once and played 4 notes and stopped. She pressed her fingers under the velvet lining at the base and lifted it free. Beneath it, a small USB drive wrapped in a piece of folded paper. The paper had a date, the month before Deborah had left the company. I didn't know what it was exactly, Deborah said. I knew the numbers were wrong. I copied them the way you copy something you think you might need to understand later. Sara picked up the drive. It was lighter than she expected. The paper was thin, almost translucent at the folds. Mama, I kept it because I was afraid throwing it away was the same as pretending I never saw anything. Deborah looked at Sara's face and then at the drive in her daughter's hand. I think it is time for someone to understand it now. Sara held the drive a moment longer, looking at it, and then looked at her mother, and the kitchen was warm and full of light, and none of that made the thing in her hand less real. She took it, and she folded the paper back around it, and she put it in her coat pocket, and she stayed long enough to finish her coffee. She went to Tae-jun's office the following morning, not the penthouse, which was theatrical in its height and its view, but the actual office, a building in a quieter district, a floor with clean proportions and real files, and the visible infrastructure of an organization run by someone who treated it as a business rather than a performance. She walked past the receptionist, who recognized her and reached for a phone. Sara was already through the door. She placed the drive on his desk without preamble. Give it to the prosecutors, she said. All of it. Tae-jun looked at the drive. He did not reach for it. He told her, with the specific flatness of someone being honest rather than strategic, what this would cost. Political protection that operated through business alliances, where the paperwork was shared, where the signatures were intertwined, where separating Choi from the network meant separating Tae-jun from some of the architecture that kept other problems contained. He was not trying to frighten her. He was stating the arithmetic. Sara said, I know what it cost you. I'm asking you anyway. And if I use it internally, Choi is finished either way. Then the system that let him steal from you and threaten my mother stays exactly as it is. And the next Choi finds someone else's mother. Tae-jun looked at the drive. He looked at the window. The morning came in flat and gray over the rooftops and gave him nothing, so he turned back and looked at Sara instead, and the silence between them was not the silence of an argument, but of something more fundamental being weighed. You keep asking me to believe you are different from the men who are hunting us, Sara said. Her voice was even. She was not pleading. Show me. She left the drive on his desk and left the office, and she did not look back. That evening, Min-suk called. The call was brief, an incident during Deborah's routine hospital transit, a monitoring appointment for her blood pressure, nothing violent in itself, but there had been men at the side entrance who had known Deborah's schedule and her usual route out. Min-suk had been there. It had been handled without harm. Sara drove to the hospital. Deborah was in a private room, the kind reserved for patients who need quiet. Two of Min-suk's people stood at the door. Deborah had a glass of water and her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of someone who has just revised her understanding of her own situation without having been given permission to process it yet. She was physically unharmed. Sara sat beside her and held her hand and made the decision she had been building toward for 3 days. She called Tae-jun that night and told him she and Deborah would leave Seoul when Deborah was cleared to travel. His voice on the phone was controlled and quiet, and he said he understood, and the call ended without either of them saying anything further. She discovered the passport delay the following morning. Not an official notice, only a status that had shifted to processing, without a timeline or explanation. The security around her building had tripled. She had counted. She arrived at Tae-jun's office without calling ahead and walked past the receptionist before the call could complete and opened his office door. Min-suk was inside. He looked at Sara, then at Tae-jun, and left without being asked. You blocked my passport, Sara said. I arranged additional processing time for your safety. That is not your decision. Choi's people tried to take your mother yesterday. I know. That is why I need to leave. Tae-jun said, You cannot leave. Not while this is not resolved. Sara stood in the center of his office and looked at him. At the desk, at the space where the drive had been, at the man behind it who had the bearing of someone who had never clearly learned the difference between protecting something and possessing it. She said, "You do not love me, but you love knowing I cannot leave." The room went entirely still. Tae-jun did not move. The air between them felt like something that had been stretched to the limit of its material. Sara said, "The moment I chose something you did not want, you became the man I was always afraid you were." She turned and walked to the door. She opened it, she paused in the frame without turning back and said, "Give the evidence to the prosecutors and let me go." She left. He did not call after her. He did not instruct Min-suk. The elevator came, and the lobby was marble underfoot and cold, and Sara walked out into the gray afternoon and kept walking, and no one followed her. She had expected to feel relief. What she felt was something older and quieter than relief, and she carried it home without knowing exactly what to call it. 2 days later, Choi ran out of patience. He moved at 3 in the morning, a professional extraction, cleanly organized, using inside information about the building layout obtained through a contact Sara had not known to identify. Sara woke in an unfamiliar room, concrete walls, a high ceiling with industrial track lighting, the unmistakable smell of diesel and cold metal that belongs to facilities built for shipping and no longer in use. Her hands were free, her phone was not in her pocket. Deborah was there, seated in a plastic chair against the opposite wall, her hands folded in her lap, her posture deliberately composed in the specific way of someone who has decided that composure is the only form of power available to them at the moment. Choi stood near the center of the room. He was dressed for business, the fine suit, the silver hair precisely in place, and he spoke in the same measured, reasonable-sounding way he used when he was cutting ribbons and receiving awards. He wanted the drive. He wanted to know where the copies had gone. He was still using the vocabulary of a conversation between equals, and that was the most frightening thing about him. Sara looked past Choi's shoulder at the far wall. A fire suppression panel was mounted near the loading access corridor. Old hardware, orange-faced, the kind that activated a deluge line when the dial housing was broken rather than turned. Beside the corridor entrance, a shipping gate lever, manual override, the kind of obsolete mechanism that throws a sectional door on its misaligned track with considerable force. She had worked briefly in facility compliance before her current role. She had written variance reports on this exact category of aging hardware. She began talking about the drive, about copies, about what had already been sent and to whom, keeping Choi's attention on her voice while she moved, slowly, naturally, 3 steps toward the wall in the rhythm of someone who is nervous and looking for something solid to stand near. She hit the fire suppression panel with her elbow at the break point. The deluge system activated in the corridor section nearest the loading entrance. The gate lever, under sudden pressure from the suppression lines running behind the wall, kicked outward with a sound like a gunshot. The sectional door dropped and jammed on its track, throwing the far corridor into chaos and darkness. The guards moved toward the sound. Choi moved toward Sara. The lights in the corridor section flickered and held. Tae-jun came through the secondary access with Min-suk, and they were calm in the way of people who have been waiting for a signal. There was no extended struggle. Choi's people were outnumbered in a way that became clear quickly, and Choi himself was detained in the time it takes to cross a room. The confrontation was controlled and brief and unambiguous in its outcome. Choi looked at Tae-jun across the dim facility, and his public voice finally left him. What remained was older and uglier, and honest in the way that very few things become honest only at the last possible moment. The copies, as he had suspected, were already gone. Tae-jun had sent everything, the drive's contents and the documents his own organization had assembled around them, to the prosecutor's office and to 3 journalists 3 days earlier, the morning after Sara had left his office. He had sat with the drive on his desk for the rest of that afternoon, and then he had made calls, and then he had done something he had never done before in his life. Deborah stood and smoothed her cardigan with both hands and walked to where Sara was standing. She looked at the scene settling around them. Min-seok directing his people, Choi being walked toward the main exit, and she reached out and took Sara's arm. Sara held her, and neither of them said anything, and the deluge system dripped steadily in the dark corridor behind them. The fallout came in the weeks that followed. Choi's arrest was a public event. 3 days of continuous news coverage and a secondary wave of investigation into the networks surrounding him. 3 of Tae-jun's business alliances dissolved within the month. A contract's portfolio worth real money separated from his organization with the particular finality of people who have decided they were never really allies and simply waited for the right moment to demonstrate it. Tae-jun made no public statements. He said nothing about the losses at all. He did not appear to say goodbye when Sara and Deborah left Seoul. Sara had not expected him to. The departure was logistically uncomplicated. Deborah's doctor cleared her on a Thursday, and they were on a flight the following Tuesday. The morning was cold and clear. The city spread below the window in its familiar geometry until it disappeared entirely into the cloud cover. Sara watched until there was nothing left to see. Months passed. She settled back into work that had been waiting for her, the ordinary forward motion of a life that had resumed after a long interruption. Deborah recovered fully, and she put the white music box back on the bookshelf in its original place, without the velvet lining, because there was no longer anything inside it that needed to be hidden. One afternoon, in a cafe she had chosen because it was quiet and faced west and had the kind of afternoon light that made reading easy, Sara looked up from her coffee and found Tae-jun at a corner table. His long black hair was tied loosely at the nape, a few strands loose near his jaw. He had no visible bodyguard. He was reading something on a phone, and he had the specific stillness of a man who had been through something costly and had not yet decided what to do with the person that cost left behind. Not soft, exactly, but calmer than she had ever seen him. He saw her at the same moment. Sara said, "Did I follow you?" Tae-jun said, "No. Your mother told Min-seok where you drink coffee." She almost smiled. She stood in the doorway with her bag on her shoulder and her coffee cooling in her hand, and looked at him across the warm, quiet room. He stood. He kept the table between them. He said, "Dinner." Sara said, "Is that an order?" "It is the first request I have made without preparing for the answer." She looked at him. She looked at the empty chair across from his table, the small arrangement of a table set for one that was now, structurally, set for 2 if someone sat down. She crossed the room and sat. "One dinner," she said. Tae-jun sat opposite her. The afternoon light came in from the west and caught the clean line of his jaw. "One was never enough for me." Sara placed her coffee down and met his eyes. "Then this time, you will have to earn the second." 1 year later, Deborah's apartment was warm and full of the smell of something cooking, and Tae-jun was in the kitchen following Deborah's instructions with the focused, slightly strained expression of someone who is competent at almost everything and has just encountered the category of task where that does not automatically help. Deborah sat at the kitchen table and watched him with an expression balanced precisely between satisfied and amused, and she offered no correction on his grip on the spoon. Later, the kitchen cleaned, Sara and Tae-jun stood on the balcony. The evening was mild. Below them, the city moved in its ordinary way, and the light was ordinary, and there was nothing extraordinary about the moment except the fact of it. Tae-jun said, "Do you regret that night?" Sara leaned against the railing. "I regret everything that forced me into that room." She was quiet for a moment, and the city settled into its evening sound below them. "But I do not regret meeting the man who was waiting inside it." Tae-jun reached over and took her hand. Not to keep her from leaving, she had chosen to stay. His fingers closed around hers, and she let them. And from inside the apartment came the small, bright sound of the music box, as Deborah wound it. 4 clear notes, traveling through the open door to the balcony, ordinary and unhidden and perfectly intact. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. When Sara stood in front of that surgery estimate with nothing left to sell, she made a choice most of us will never have to face. And she made it without losing herself. Have you ever been at the edge of everything you had and still found a line you refused to cross? She left half the money on the table and wrote a note. In the middle of her most desperate night, she returned what was not hers. Is there something about who you are that you would protect, even when no one would know if you didn't? The music box Deborah kept quietly for years held a truth that changed the course of everything. Have you ever discovered that someone you love was carrying a secret far heavier than you imagined, and that the weight of it was never meant for you to bear alone? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, sacrifice, and truth, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel